Well, 1980 was a momentous year in my life. There's two major events that happened that year. That fall, I began seminary at Dallas Seminary, and that December I got married. And so I packed up my bride and moved cross-country from Los Angeles to Dallas, Texas. We moved from Disneyland to Big D. We moved from La La Land to the state of mind, which is Texas, where everything is the biggest and the bestest. We moved from the land of the fruits and the nuts with the flakes in between to the buckle of the Bible Belt. And we were in for a culture shock in moving to Dallas. We traded the beaches of Southern California for the plains of Texas. And if you've ever been there, you know that there is nothing quite as flat and barren as West Texas. As we drove from Los Angeles to Dallas, you get to El Paso, and you're only halfway there. And the rest of it is West Texas, where there may be a respectable tumbleweed here or there, but the rest of it is just... We traded the 72 degrees year-round moderate temperatures to well over 100 in the summer and ice storms in the winter. In fact, the summer that I moved to Dallas that year, I got there at the end of August in 1980, and they had what they call the Texas heat wave, where we had over 60 days that had not gone below 100 degrees. And you arrive and think, I drive there in my 66 Mustang with black vinyl interior and no AC. What am I doing? We traded flip-flops for cowboy boots. We traded all sports. At that time in Los Angeles, we had two NFL teams, the Rams and the Raiders. We had two baseball teams, the Dodgers and the Angels. You had the NBA Lakers, you had the NHL Kings. And we got to Texas and find out there are only two sports in Texas. There is football and spring football. and as the saying goes, and probably some truth to that, or at least people believed it was true, is that the reason that there was a hole in the roof of Texas Stadium was so God could watch the Cowboys play. True story. We had to learn a whole new language. We went from, dude, that's like totally tubular, to, hey y'all, are you fixing to go? Are you fixing to leave? Can I carry you someplace? Are you one of them good old boys that's all hat, no cattle? And it's like, but perhaps no culture shock, or no shock was as deep as getting used to the blue laws of Texas. The blue laws were laws of things that you could buy and not buy on Sundays. It was originally designed to protect Sunday as a day of worship. We were living in Dallas in the early 80s. The blue laws were repealed in 1985. So by the time they were repealed, some of them had gotten a little goofy and didn't quite make sense. You'll see in a minute, but there were things you could buy but you couldn't buy. You could buy paper plates, but you couldn't buy china plates. You could buy a hammer, but you couldn't buy the nails. Seriously. You could buy a screwdriver, but you couldn't buy the screws. The whole idea was that you wouldn't work. And you could kind of get what you needed, but not kind of get what you needed. And it prevented you from doing that. You could buy a blank cassette tape, since they still use cassette tapes in 1980. But you couldn't buy a recorded cassette. And then one of the goofiest ones of all, you could buy beer, but you couldn't buy a baby bomb. And like I said, by the time the laws were repealed in 1985, they had lost their significance and their purpose, and they had also gotten kind of strange in what you could buy and not buy. But as we discovered when we lived in Dallas in those years, is that there were some restrictions about what you could and could not do, especially as it related to Sundays and worship and all those kind of things. Well, none of that is new, because the same situation existed in the first century when Jesus walked on the planet. And that as he encountered the religious leaders and the scribes and the Pharisees, there were laws and restrictions about what you could and could not do. And when Jesus showed up on the planet, things changed. And as he said, he came to set aside some of those restrictions because they had lost their whole purpose, as we'll see this morning. So turn with me this morning to Mark chapter 2. As we continue our study of the Gospel of Mark, we come to the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. And so listen as I read Mark chapter 2, beginning of verse 23 through verse 6 of chapter 3, and I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Mark chapter 2, beginning in verse 23, it says, "One Sabbath, he, Jesus, was going through the grain fields. And as they, Jesus and his disciples, we'll see in a minute, made their way through, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?' And he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come here.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?' But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." As we've mentioned over the last couple of weeks, is that the passages we're looking at today are the fourth and the fifth episodes, if you will, the fourth and fifth scenes of 5 events that take place in chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, where Jesus is creating conflict. And he's creating conflict simply by being there and doing things differently than have been done before. And through each one of these situations, you see that Jesus demonstrates that he is the Lord over a different part of life, a different part of culture, a different part of society. And so as we saw several weeks ago in the beginning of chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, is that Jesus healed a paralytic. It was the scene where Jesus is teaching in a house. 4 men bring their buddy on a pallet or a litter. They can't get in the house, so they tear the roof off and they bring him down and they lower him in. And through that scene, Jesus demonstrated that he is the Lord over sickness, that he could heal the man, but he's also the Lord over sin, that he could forgive the sins of the man as well. Then as we saw right after that in the verses 13 to 17, where one of the men that Jesus calls to be one of his disciples, Matthew, or Levi, as he's known in chapter 2, is a tax collector. And through that scene of calling Levi to be one of his disciples, Levi then throws a party for his business associates, and Jesus demonstrates that he's the Lord over redemption. That he came to call the least and the lost, those that we think are beyond the grace of God. But the reality is that Jesus can touch them and bring them to himself, invite even the worst of the worst